My name is Stephen Nelson, and I'm Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our third session of Celebrating Conservation, a series of conversations on its past, present, and future. Over the past 2 weeks, participants have discussed the history, expansion, and transformation of the field and how it has affected the questions conservators bring to their objects of study. They've also explored the role of conservation in the context of our complicated present. From the Center to Conservation, from Digital Experience and the Office of the Secretary General, many colleagues came together in bringing this 4-week-long celebration to fruition, and I would like to thank all of them collectively. I would also like to thank our participants for their insightful and generous contributions. I would like to hand the virtual microphone to Carmen Ramos, the National Galleries of Art's Chief Curatorial and Conservation Officer. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the National Gallery's series of discussions in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the founding of our Conservation Division. I'm Carmen Ramos, Chief Curatorial and Conservation Officer here at the National Gallery, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this third session that explores evolving ideas of innovation in 21st century conservation practices. I'm especially honored to introduce today's session because innovation and research has been such a defining feature of our conservation program. Our Conservation Division has had many milestones and achievements, from establishing a scientific research department, which is among the first of its kind in a museum context, to in 2007, establishing a facility that uses advanced imaging technology to study artworks and materials, and to the division's ongoing efforts to share its research with the field through our peer-reviewed biennial publication, Factor. At this moment, we reflect on the foundational ideas of art conservation in museums and imagine how we will chart the paths to the field, within and beyond museum walls in the 21st century. We understand that innovation can be achieved by the ways in which we study, treat, and produce new information about how objects are made and preserved, in addition to the important perspectives raised by today's speakers that urge us to think more expansively about the context of our work and the nature of our world today and how it shapes and redefines our museum and cultural heritage work. The past several years have raised urgent questions about the museum field broadly defined. We must think and work collaboratively and constantly expand our frames of reference. What is innovation in our current world as we face the challenges and obstacles of climate change and as we reset our cultural priorities with equity in mind? Innovation in thinking expands notions of ownership or stewardship of art objects created in the past and present, and they broaden the context for treating and examining objects and ask us to think more deeply about the stories we tell. Our speakers today work in a variety of contexts and approach the topic of innovation from different and compelling vantage points. This discussion and others in the series give attention to how art conservation is evolving. This is not happening in an isolated way, but is occurring alongside changing ideas in museums, art history, and society. Planning for what conservation will look like in the 50 years from now requires us to think about the deep relationship between the methodologies of preservation, the development of collections, and the ways we define what matters historically and in art history. I want to thank our Conservation Division and Stephen Nelson and his staff at the Center for organizing this important program that is creating a forum for our community at large to consider the future of the conservation field. It's a pleasure now to welcome Barbara Berry, Head of Conservation Research at the National Gallery of Art, who will moderate today's session.
Thank you, Stephen and Carmen, for your thoughtful introductions. We're grateful for the formal support of conservation within the National Gallery of Art for 50 years, and for this opportunity to reflect on the past and consider the future. Today, as you heard, the theme of our conversation is evolving innovation in 21st century conservation. We have 3 distinguished guests who will discuss this with me. Pip Lawrenson, Professor of Conservation and Director of the MSc program in the Conservation of Contemporary Art and Media a new program at the University College London, Laura Angelova, Head of Conservation Research at the National Archives at Kew in England, and Hector Bardecilla Hernandez, Founding Director General of the Centro de Conservación y Restauración de Puerto Rico. Thank you all for being here. Our speakers' pre-recorded presentations are available until December the 12th. I'd like to begin our conversation by considering the word innovation. And Pip, you did this in your recorded presentation. Would you tell us briefly what you were thinking about the word and its relationship to conservation?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. So nice to be here. Welcome, everybody. Yes, I mean, I think when I was asked to join this panel, I really had a problem with how I felt about this idea of innovation, because I think it's been used very much in terms of a kind of unilinear evolution, very much within that sort of hierarchy of progress. And, and I think we really want to question that in what we're going to talk about today. But so it sent me back to look at the etymology of the word innovation. And it was a nice surprise, because it was introduced into the English language in sort of mid-15th century. It derives from the Latin innovare, and it really is about change and renewal and a kind of restoration, actually, as much as it is new things. So I think that sort of sent me thinking about how knowledge operates, how important it is at this time to be looking at knowledge that might have been overlooked or discarded, and not necessarily kind of having the same sort of trajectory of this idea of progress. And how do we think about that within conservation? And I think it kind of, I think that idea of the forgotten and the overlooked is just so important to us at this time, because I think all three of us, actually, if I can, listening to our talks, I think have this idea of the value of not necessarily the most, I think Laura said in her talk, not looking at the most high-tech forms of innovation, but both Laura and Hector have pointed to actually the value of those forms of innovation that might actually be rediscovering older forms of knowledge and might actually create the greatest benefit. So just to get us started, that was where I was, what I thought about when I was thinking about that term.
Thank you. And it's a great start. And actually, Hector, I'd like you to weigh in a little bit here, because your notions of innovation as a continuum and always there and always to be recognized are really interesting. And that comes, I think, from your practice in conservation, which is a little different from the art museum practice. So if you can expand on that continuum notion for us, how you feel about that.
Sure. In my conversation that we have planning for this panel, but also in my video, one of the questions that I was asking myself was how we think about innovation. Always we think always about progress, and that kind of linear, time frame. But usually, and this is something that I have been reflecting with my work and my practice. We have to think that our ancestors and the people before us, they innovated, they created new things. And usually the way to look at those projects and the way to solve the pressing issues of our discipline and our complex society, for me, has been always look at the past, sit back, reflect, and think about what others have done in the past to get to the present. And for me, looking at those methodologies, looking at traditional materials, looking at practices from the past has informed a lot of my decision-making process through my different projects. So that is a little bit of my reflection of innovation. We don't have to think about this as a linear time frame, but just as a continuum of improvement, but in a conscious way and respectful way, looking at the past.
Yeah, thanks. That's I think that helps contextualize innovation as something that's not new necessarily.
Uh-huh.
Laura, you've had experience with bringing new tools to the field, and it's a challenge, right? Because innovation doesn't come easily, does it?
It can be challenging. I think one of the key things to designing newer innovative treatment materials, which we've worked on in the past, can be challenging in the sense of making sure that you are speaking to everyone that is needing to use these materials and really hearing what they're saying. So I'd say the most challenging part of designing, if we have to design new and innovative materials, is ensuring that that generation is done through really equitable collaboration with all the different stakeholders involved, rather than being driven simply by a need to innovate, a perceived need to innovate and to design new materials that are entirely driven by kind of research goals or desires, right? So working very closely with conservators, of course, but also very closely with the communities whose artworks or objects or things, as I talk about in my presentation, we are seeking to conserve and, more importantly, make accessible to current stakeholders and current generations.
Laura, do you see a parallel between innovating in tools and innovating in how we respect the objects that are being treated? Is it different?
I'd say there's a parallel there. I mean, but it has to be done, I think, thoughtfully and with care, I think. And both Hector and Pip have talked about this kind of slowing down and thinking about the tools that we are designing in a bespoke way with the materials, the actual pieces that we are looking at, and the communities to whom they belong. So, yeah, I think that's a joint effort.
Well, I'm interested in this question because I think, one of the things that is extraordinary about conservation is the degree to which it works in a kind of interdisciplinary, but also sometimes transdisciplinary way in terms of drawing in such a broad range of thinking from the humanities and also the sciences. And I think I know this has been a theme of conservation, since our conservation ancestors kind of established the field. But I do think it's worth us really spending time to think about how we do that. And, what I think this is a moment where the humanities are really important to me as well as the sciences, because it is about how do we develop the questions so that we have the right tools to answer the pressing questions. And, how do we draw in? I mean, I thought it was fantastic that Laura is drawing in ideas from new materialism to kind of change the frame of which we approach our collections. And I think if the last few years have taught us anything, I think it is that capacity to see our positionality, to see the particular frame that we're coming from, whether it is geographic or training or, to do with the kind of ideas and literature that we've been, brought up on, trained in, and see that as just one perspective amongst many, then I think that is really going to transform the sorts of conversations and the sorts of questions we have within conservation. But I don't know what others think about that.
Hector, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Pip and Laura. And also another, I think part of the discussion is that conservation, yes, is a multi and also sometimes transdisciplinary discipline, but also innovation has been always thought as a way to get to point A to point B. But we also need to ask ourselves, what are the consequences for the decisions, and the things that we do to get to point A and point B? What other aspects of the practice will impact? What methodologies are we using? So that for me is also part of the questions that we need to ask as part, of the conversation.
So it's interesting. I mean, we're talking about trying to not go forward in a linear way and not thinking about innovation as linear, but perhaps a more holistic contribution to the practice of conservation and preservation. And maybe if we can just get down to brass tacks, and from the three of you, where are we needing to put some effort into innovation? Is it innovative thinking? Is it building collaborations? Walter Isaacson famously says innovation requires collaborations. Or do we start, how do we start framing the questions that we need to start becoming innovative in order to answer? So any one of the three of you can go with that.
Maybe I can kick off a little bit here in terms of the reason why I've started kind of thinking along the lines that I've been looking at in the presentation I gave, is kind of moving from this world of the museum and gallery sector into the archival sector, where I think conservation and heritage science are a very interesting space to work within. And I outline a little bit of archival science and archival theory in my presentation because I myself wasn't educated about this very well. And I think there's a very interesting thing that happens in archives where we have a fluidity between when one of the records in the archives is valued for its context or just the information in it, and when it's valued for its material properties and we don't want to sample it or do any sort of invasive or destructive analysis. And in parallel to that, there's a kind of fluidity in the conservation of records that arises as well, kind of I think a lot of people think of archival conservation as a sort of mass process of very large quantities of material, but sometimes we also put in very specific and individual efforts into a single item. So there's a lot of interesting fluidities that happen in the archive that spark these questions around, when do we develop specific treatments for a thing or a record, and how do we go about doing that? And I think within records, record collections, there's they hold a lot of value to the different communities that they affect, whether that's directly or indirectly. And I think we discussed this a little bit, but more concretely, one of the things I'd like to think about more and more is when we approach those records, kind of viewing them from that perspective. Whose records are these? Whose lives do they affect? And then consulting with those communities through ways that both allow them to engage with those records because they may or may not know that they're there, but also to understand how we can best make that record accessible for them, whether that's through an innovative treatment that we develop for that record specifically, or whether that's through just simply allowing that audience to come to the record, and perhaps it doesn't require treatment or they would prefer it in the state that it is. And how do we go about doing that and facilitating that?
Pip, your practice is now not so much the thing only, but the thing has intangible parts, and sometimes it's completely intangible. It's a thing, it's a happening that was. How do you bring the classical traditional ways of preserving and conserving to dealing with those kinds of objects that are now becoming part of museum collections?
Well, I guess, it was really interesting because quite early on when Tate started to acquire live performance works in 2006, I remember the Arts Council in the UK kind of gathered everybody together to talk about this as an issue, and actually those who were practicing involved in collecting and thinking about how to collect live works, nobody actually saw it as a problem. It was really interesting. It was sort of, conceptually, I think people struggled with it, but actually what conservators were doing were asking questions like, what is it that's important to preserve? How might we kind of transmit this work? What are our different tools that we have that we know from our profession? What can we learn from other areas? And, that might be from how live works are transmitted from different traditions, whether it's dance or theatre or political activism, and then thinking about Laura's points about the record, it gave us this wonderful kind of opportunity, I think, as, okay, these were not routine problems. And I think when we have kind of, which we often do in contemporary art conservation, have these non-routine problems, it is that opportunity to really think about who we need to bring into the conversation, and whether that is different networks of care which is one of Annette Decker's kind of phrases, which has become so important, I think, over the last few years, but just that whole idea of looking outside the museum for where that expertise already exists, that we can learn from, and how do we as conservators within the museum actually join those networks who may have been caring for these works for 50 years. There might have been particular people, for example, around a work that we looked at through the project Reshaping the Collectible, when artworks live in the museum. We looked at a work by Tony Conrad, which was an experimental music and film piece that had first been performed in 1972 and came into Tate's collection after Tony Conrad's death. So he was quite anti-score. So we could have only really done that work of thinking about how we can transmit that work into the future and how we can care for that work if we had, we couldn't have done it unless we'd embraced that broader network. So I think it's also about questioning some of our assumptions about knowledge and who holds that knowledge. And I know that, I think this is something that I think, Hector, you've been thinking about within your context as well within Puerto Rico.
My question is how, if that classical traditional practice is so rigid, my question has been can we develop an adaptive approach, a conservation field that is responsive to the heritage by its context? That is a little bit of my question. And also, and how we can adapt, that rigid model without affecting the ethics, and the core principles of the conservation profession. And that for me has been part of my journey in Puerto Rico, thinking about and how we can help, move forward a conservation center here. And my context is also a little bit the same in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I've collaborated there, Dominican Republic and other islands in the Caribbean region. We're facing almost the same issues. But yeah, that's basically my approach. How we can go from that rigid way through a more flexible way.
That sounds great. You mentioned some of the precepts of conservation, and I think one important one is neither to add nor to take away from the object. And that partly is because the material it's made from may have meaning that we do not yet perceive, and we should not inject anything of our own into it and make these kinds of decisions. But it does tie it back just a little bit to one of the questions that's come into the Q&A, which is about the materials. It can actually preserve not only the status quo of an object, but all the content it's carrying. What innovative methods, if we can use it, and have prove them to?
Yeah, perhaps maybe for the attendees' question, thinking specifically about this concept of new materials that are tailored for conservation of challenging items, if we want to think of it this way. But yeah, there's definitely been a lot of innovation in this world in the sense of designing materials through understanding the composition of the surfaces that we're treating and then tailoring either the solutions that are used or the way that they're applied. For example, if we're just thinking about cleaning an item, and of course, work on as well at the Tate Nano Restart project, and I believe that looked at a variety of gels that were bespoke designed for cleaning surfaces, and then nano emulsions and micro emulsions, I believe, were also looked at. There's a whole world of analytical technologies now that are being developed, not just adopted from other fields, but developed and co-developed with heritage scientists and conservators to better understand the composition of the materials that we're treating and also the effect of those treatments on the items that we're looking at. But I think also with the gels, we've seen the whole gamut, right from incredibly bespoke polymer material to essentially the use of things like gelin or agar that are relatively widely available and easy to prepare. And both of those ends of the spectrum have limitations and benefits. And I think many people have said, the more tools in the box of the conservator, the better. But I think as we've discussed, it's really important to work with the communities and the kind of global conservation community in understanding what is actually available and accessible to everyone out there, not just some of us in kind of organizational studios that can afford to purchase some more expensive materials, or to work with a heritage scientists or conservation scientists who can help us prepare them in the lab. So ensuring that when we think about innovative materials and technologies, we are thinking about not just being able to apply them at our organizations in Europe or America, but around the world, as Hector mentions as well.
In your practice with time-based media, that requires some.
I mean, one of the things that I do think is interesting in the tools that have been developed and in this sort of rapidly emerging field of time-based media conservation is that actually these fantastic open source tools that have been developed for the community, like QC tools, for example, have really pushed what we need to know so that we can effectively use the tools. So I really like the exchange between the development of tools and then our knowledge, and it seems to be that kind of dialogue seems so valuable. But I'd like to hear from Hector really about this whole question of access to these tools and innovative products.
We face in the architecture field is that the object, which is the building, is in the exterior environment. So it's really difficult to control, the temperatures, the climate, and the soiling and all the things that happens to a building. So in the built heritage sector, we have to innovate, and start looking at products from the construction field and using specific products for cleaning or consolidation of stone, or other materials such as terracotta that can not only serve its purpose for which what is created, but also that can accommodate a little bit its context, exterior temperature, and or exterior conditions. So a little bit of the materials and the things that are happening in the construction world has shaped, the conservation field from the heritage sector.
Don't you love that? Because I love the fact, I think even the nanogels were originally created actually to treat bed sores. So they came from a medical, application. And I love how conservation has this sort of magpie kind of capacity to really work with some of these innovations which are developed for much larger fields than ours. And to really kind of work to think about how they might help us do the job that we do. And I just want to also say about the Nano Restart project, I think what was really lovely about that was the time to really do the kind of beautiful systematic work that Laura and colleagues did to really compare these very low-tech solutions with these very high-tech ones. And I think that was a really important part of the integrity of that project, is that it wasn't just about the shiny new thing. It was also about really rigorously testing it against things that we all have access to some degree.
And I think some of what Hector's talking about is that sometimes innovation goes back to your rediscovery of what the word entails, Pip, which is discovering things that have been forgotten that are good and useful. And in terms of application to preservation in countries like Puerto Rico, or places like Puerto Rico, and countries that can't have really challenging environments, can't commit to a massive full-scale ideas, helping rediscover the traditional ways that people worked to preserve their buildings or their artwork at their moment in time. And I think, Hector, you're looking at some of that.
And I will tell you, for example, we have really few conservators in Puerto Rico, and but the mostly the issues that we have to bring in people, from outside, from the U.S., from Mexico, other places, and the challenging thing is that we need to teach them or specific context, temperatures, how the lack of resources. We can. If we want to buy materials for conservation treatment, we need to ship in that from outside. And mostly what my questions has been in the past is not only how we can have that, and do the proper treatment and preserve our collections and our buildings, but also how we can develop a specific, methodology, specific practice based on our needs, but also based on our available resources. For example, right now, one of the things that we're trying to do in Puerto Rico is identifying analytical equipment, to know what we have to actually advance the heritage science field here in the island, and how we can collaborate also with other islands like your Virgin Islands, but also Dominican Republic, and that kind of also assessing what we have. That is part of the issues that we're facing, and establishing collaborations, as we mentioned earlier. Innovation is part of. I think one big step is establishing collaborations. How we can develop collaborations with universities, and research centers in Puerto Rico, but also in other areas of the Caribbean, and exchange information, exchange projects, and work collaboratively towards a goal, which, for example, is advancing heritage science. So thinking about that methodology, this is not new. That way of doing things is not new. It happened in the past when in 1950s, 1960s, the conservation field was still small. And I'm telling you, I've been learning a lot from what other people in the past did to lead the way and have a guide.
As all of us are thinking along these lines of kind of working together and with communities and with conservators around the world, and I think this relates to one of the Q&A questions as well, about kind of ensuring that gap doesn't increase as we develop new methods and new technologies, and as Hector said, trying to find technologies and methods that work for those communities. I think it's really important to touch on something that does happen with innovation in kind of conservation and development of new materials, which is, in my experience, as I said at the beginning, it requires collaboration between, in some cases, scientists and conservators if we're looking at developing a new treatment method. And when I started doing this work, there was often this perception that, the scientists come in with this kind of ego saying, well, this is an easy problem. We have solvent equations and we'll just look at that and we'll figure it out, and it's really important to ensure that this doesn't happen, as well as we start to work across to ensure that we close this gap, and that we do work with communities, and that we do work with people like Hector and the center that he started there and across the world, and we don't just come in, saying we have solutions for you, here they are, and they're developed and they work in our institutions, and we have these tools and they work to do this, right? We have to work very closely with people to hear what their needs are and to let them lead on that development, and to bring to them the tools that they need to kind of develop the field in their space, and with a lot of respect. And I think that's really important. And I think it's a parallel between this kind of designing of innovative materials and also in working together around the world.
In the past two sessions, the devastating flood of the River Arno in Florence in 1966 that caused inestimable damage to the cultural heritage, both the built and the movable, and libraries and archives. I think those are often overlooked, that libraries and archives in Florence were as badly damaged as the frescoes and the great altarpieces. And that's sort of seen as, or became a moment of change and collaboration. But without asking for a disaster to happen, what does the field need to do to get together to try to explore where to go next? I mean, we've got a great need globally for cultural patrimony to be preserved. We've got a burgeoning idea of what art is. We've got increasing awareness that records are also as important as artwork, and being carriers of our history and our cultures. So what do we do to try and create the next steps? That planning for the 21st century is heavy.
I think there's some great innovations that are going on in training, and I was told recently about Joel Wicken's preventive conservation at Winterthur program, where she is kind of really thinking about where these students might need to be working and needing to understand the context, just as Hector was saying, of, what are the resources, what is the kind of context environmentally that you're going into, the social context, thinking much, much more broadly. And then just thinking about, it's really interesting for me going from a museum into a university, because of course I'm going to have these brilliant students, very international program, and I can't, work without partners with their collections. So, partnerships are going to be absolutely central to that program. So thinking about how we develop those collaborations over time through student projects is actually really exciting. And I think that is something that we've got the opportunity to do with our training programs, and kind of work together to really think about how to effectively not just produce, students who are going to go into the, the cutting edge laboratories with all the amazing kit, but how are we going to produce students who can go out into the field and really make a difference in some of these other contexts?
I totally agree. I think the base foundation for collaboration, when to move forward the discipline is definitely on training. And I will say also that there is a need to not only outreach art communities that we are impacting, but also other professionals. Usually when the feedback that I've received, for example, in Puerto Rico, when we try to do any kind of analytical study on a work of art, in any specific lab, is that scientists don't understand, that how this applies to, the work that we do as conservators. And the same with, some archaeological projects with archaeologists. And also, it's also this question, how how we can make our discipline more visible to also those other long established, professions, and we how we can make these partnerships, through outreach, but also how we can frame our discipline in a way that they can understand what we do, you know. And that's a little bit of my experience, but also not only training, but also outreach to other disciplines.
I agree with that, Hector. I think the idea of building community and sharing ownership
Takes time as well, doesn't it? I think the
Yeah, everything takes
sciences
time.
have really understood the importance of these collaborations that go on for multiple, years. And I think, but certainly within contemporary art conservation, we were so lucky because in kind of 2004, we got European funding to build the community that still survives today. We still collaborate. We're still talking to each other. We're bringing in a new kind of generation to kind of continue that work. And that is so important, that kind of funding of networks and the continued funding of networks as well. And I absolutely agree with you, Hector. I think, you cannot helicopter a kind of scientist into a problem. This is why heritage science, I think, and conservation science is so valuable, because the problems are super complex and we have to be asking the right questions and make sure that it is a question that science can help us with, right? So I just think, actually, I completely agree, just valuing what we've built up, and kind of honoring some of the, it takes a long time, right?
I think we do have time, and we should give ourselves time to create these collaborations that work, but also to do, to get everybody on board. It's everybody has to be singing from the same songbook, right? And I think an issue with collaboration is sometimes people are all standing there in the choir reading from their own sheets. And how do we're going to have to create ways to get our conversations intersecting. And I think this is actually a really good start, because it's telling us that this is hard work, right? It's going to be long.
Again, a lovely collaboration that I've been really lucky to enjoy for many years is with René van der Waal and Vivian van Saals in the Netherlands. And we did some research actually about collaboration, and this idea of how do we create this shared problem space. I really like this visualization of a shared problem space. So you actually develop a description of what the problem is together. It needs to start right at the beginning. And I think that is, there's those important lessons, I think, to learn from that. That's
a beautiful way of framing it. Start right at the beginning. I guess, Laura's had a little bit of experience with that, but it's been hard. It's sometimes hard to make that framing of the problem and the solution right from the beginning. And it's a place where I think we have to create channels. Somebody has asked if digital media helps with that.
I think so. I think certainly in terms of sparking communication, I think, the question is around whether digital access and social media have made collaboration easier. I think it's quite a curious space, because if I'm talking as an employee of an organization, I generally, the social media of that organization is kind of led by an entirely different team. And we've been lucky enough to kind of develop a kind of close relationship with that team and showcase how important conservation is and how interesting the work that we do is, and get that word out through the social media of that organization. But I think certainly, as I described, kind of looking at the objects that we have, looking at how we can publicize them through those channels, and seeing kind of who responds and what kind of questions they have in terms of the research we do on them, the treatment that we apply, the kind of scientific analysis that we do, that can all kind of come from responses to digital digital social media. Sorry, that doesn't even make sense. Social media. It's all digital, isn't it? Yeah, sorry, I'll just hand over. I think Hector had something to say as well.
Yeah.
Actually, I was looking at the question that we have about are materials manufacturers collaborating with conservation scientists, and I will tell you that this is not something new. From the construction field, which I come from the architecture background, I will tell you that usually manufacturers and material scientists for buildings, they work closely all the time because we have to develop standards, maybe the art conservation field can learn a little bit of how that collaboration happens in the built heritage sector. So definitely something that it's need to be fostered, that is already happening in other similar fields.
Yeah, there's been a really interesting collaboration with paint manufacturers from Bronwyn Ormsby and her team at Tate, and I know others. And I think I was so interested to understand how vulnerable those materials are to changes in kind of geopolitical circumstances in the world, because they're so dependent on complex supply chains, and you realize the difficulty of actually creating those consistent materials, and then of course there's the whole issue of what's proprietary information and this dance around what scientists find out and whether that will be confirmed. But I think we, as museum people, we maintain this myth of stability, and you see it with these art materials as well. Just how often I would go to, when I went to their labs, they would be busy trying to find a replacement because a particular material was no longer available because of a war or a drought or some international, it just shows how connected, I guess, we are.
Yeah, that is interesting. Actually, we're very close to the end, and talking about how interconnected we are, and yet disconnected sometimes too, is kind of an interesting theme here. But in the last few minutes, do you have a specific notion you want to leave us with, or a question you want us to think about in our last few minutes?
I think the thing I'm really kind of, interested in, I guess, in my new role is how do we train the next generation of conservators to really be at the table for these big conversations, these big challenges that are hitting us. And also, how do we ensure that we come to that table understanding the very specific kind of positionality of our knowledge, our background, our histories, our geographies. And that seems to me something that would really be an innovative for the field.
Thinking about innovation in terms of material treatment has kind of gone down on my list these days because I don't develop this kind of work as much. So I have turned my lens when it comes to innovation and treatment about thinking about what we treat, why we treat, how we treat it, and kind of how we view the records in our care, and how we think more about kind of access rather than future long-term preservation. And I think many people have touched on this, and we've all mentioned many times Jane Henderson's paper, Beyond Lifetimes in This World. I think what I really like to imagine, and I think thinking about kind of new materialism, as we mentioned in Jane Bennett's talk, where I showed this spectrum between, I think, owner and hoarder. And this idea that she talks about, where she says kind of that hoarders may have a special privileged ability to kind of hear the language and understand the agential properties of the materials that they hoard. And in a way, maybe we're in a privileged position because of our proximity to the items that we care for, and that we are tasked with providing access to or preserving for the future, and hopefully both. And so in a way, maybe we're privileged in being able to tell those stories and to understand that power that they have a bit better, and to use that ability that proximity to those materials, to really speak with communities, with others, to try to understand better ways of connecting people with those records, whether that's through innovative treatments or through long-term preservation, or through just simply allowing people access to them more easily.
Yeah, 3 specific questions have come to my mind in this discussion. The first one is how we think about the conservation practice. For whom we are conserving or preserving. And the last one is how the conservation field can be more responsive to the communities that it serves and their heritage. And that is something that we need to keep asking ourselves for a couple of years.
Yeah. Well, if I can briefly summarize how I'm feeling too about this conversation, which has been terrific, just absolutely terrific. I think I'm hearing that innovation is not about change for change's sake at all. That's not part of why conservators in the field would want innovation. And it has to be an intentional action. And it's often enacted through collaborations. That's been part of a theme that's come up among all 3 of you. And the innovation is not anything new. It's part of an evolving engagement with collections and communities. And I think what's innovative is recognizing new sets of stakeholders is involved in our field. And while innovation has been manifested in changes in the way we exhibit, preserve, treat, and analyze objects, the big innovations are coming in broader new ways for our field, and the ways we're interacting and thinking about objects, as Laura just beautifully described. And the objects are both iconic and quotidian, and that they are all deserving of our attention and our interaction. So I've really enjoyed talking with all of you here. I appreciate very much the stimulating conversation that you've engendered here, making me think a great deal more about this, and more specifically as well as generally. So I'm just going to thank our speakers, Pip, Hector, and Laura, one more time. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your questions and your comments. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thanks.